They wanted Sweden to take part on the German and Austrian side. And they said that we are obliged to fulfill what Charles XII started, namely fighting the Russians.
Professor Zander, how did Sweden become an empire? And I asked this question in particular because of Sweden's relatively smaller population when compared to, like, let's say, Germans and Poles and Russians, right?
Yeah, you're so correct. So I would say it is kind of an anomaly that Sweden could become an empire because it hadn't the population or the industry that it really needed to become so big as it was for some 100 years. And you could say it has two starting points. The earlier one is already in the 16th century when Eric XIV starts to expand to the east. But the big upswing is with Gustavus Adolphus in the early 17th century. And he is, as usual, as Swedish kings are, at war with Denmark. We are always at war with Denmark in the period from some, 13th century and onwards until the 18th century. And during these fights, he also gets involved with in a war in Poland and is quite successful. And this spills over to the 30-year war. And then you could say that if you want a very traditional explanation, you would say that Sweden's way to become a great power is that Gustavus Adolphus defends the Protestantic faith. Because this is not
Oh,
that long after Martin Luther. And Sweden has become a Lutheran country, a Protestant country. And now Gustavus Adolphus is bringing troops to what is nowadays Germany to fight against the Catholic and their armies. And he is a skillful warrior king, and he dies in 1632, which is, you will have a 30-year war for many years to come. It don't take an end until 1648. But Sweden becomes, during this period, a major power, and it also gets territory in Germany, what's nowadays Germany. So a more modern explanation would be that Sweden wants to become a great power because of trade. Because you can see that they have a plan making the Baltic Sea a Swedish sea. It's like the Romans, they had the middle sea as Mare Nostrum, our sea. And now the Swedes, they have a similar solution, you could say.
or later when the Ottomans had the Black Sea and Mediterranean, and for a while they call it the Ottoman Lake, kind of like that, in control of that
Exactly.
trade route. When you say that under King Gustav and during the 30-Year War, um, Swedish troops went into Germany, well, what is modern day Germany now? Were these troops all Swedish, or were there Swedes in addition to mercenaries and other nations?
Like most of our armies at this stage, it, it is Swedes in minority, I would say.
Oh,
And quite a lot of the soldiers are coming for what nowadays is Finland, but that is a part of Sweden called the
oh, I
Eastern
see.
Half. But also they have a lot of troops that have their origins in, for instance, Germany. And it was quite common if you lost a battle, you could just change side. So instead of becoming prisoner of war, you became a member of a new army. And of course, you could perhaps get some trouble with loyalty, but it seemed like it worked most of the times.
Interesting. Professor Zander, I could talk about this subject for another 10 minutes, but instead of doing that, I want to go talk about another Swedish king. You mentioned that Gustav died, and this king also died an untimely death. Um, in our prior communications, I spoke with you about Charles XII. That I learned about him almost accidentally when I was reading Peter the Great's biography. And he's just such a fascinating character, and he's important not just for Swedish history, but also, I think, European history. So let's talk about Charles XII. And as I understand it, you're actually doing a project on it.
Yes, me and a colleague, we are writing a book about Charles XII in Swedish cinema. And
Oh,
he was
interesting.
kind of an important person in Sweden most of the times in the 19th century and up until the Second World War. And
You
still, I
mean his
mean, you can
legend,
find
his impact?
his impact, you could say,
Yeah,
because already Voltaire, the famous French intellectual, wrote
yeah.
a biography. I mean, it's not many years after Charles XII died. And Voltaire makes him into what was very popular in the 18th century, the tragic hero.
Huh.
So, and then you don't have to acknowledge all his mistakes because he is so good on the battlefield. And it's kind of meant to be that he will be defeated or even killed. So that fitted a heroic pattern. And that hasn't, I mean, that hasn't been the final uh, way of seeing Charles XII because he has been kind of a battleground in Sweden. And
In what sense? Why?
some wanted him as this big warrior king, great warrior king. Others said that he was unresponsible. Why should he make war in other countries than Sweden most of his time as a king, while Sweden became a country that was more ridden of with poverties and a lot of people died of they didn't have nourishment enough and so on. And those who survived, they were also they had the risk of becoming a part of a Swedish army. And most of those who were in the Swedish army didn't die in battle. They died of diseases or accidents or something like that. So it
Oh,
wasn't much of
wow.
a career becoming a soldier.
Um, Let me dig into Charles XII. And by doing that, I want to really use that as a pretext to talk about Swedish culture then. One of the things that I learned about Charles XII is that he primarily spoke German, especially in childhood. Was that the thing in Swedish royal families that they spoke German?
Or French. It
Okay,
depended kind of the fashion of the time.
I
But
see.
and I would say that the German language is very important in Sweden from the time of the Hanseatic League in the 14th century and onwards. But from the 18th century, French becomes more and more popular among the elite. Uh, and he is also taught by not only Swedes, but also other important persons because they think that, he's a king. He should have the best
Yeah,
persons that could guide him.
yeah.
And also, it becomes quite a short education because he becomes king already at 15 years of age. And from 1697, when he becomes king, he is on the battlefield almost all the time.
Another thing about him, by the way, this thing that we were talking about, where he spoke primarily German, uh, back then in Europe for our audience, many members of the royal family didn't speak necessarily the language of the country over which they reigned, so it's not that unusual. Um, Another thing about, we're talking about being unresponsible. I want to pick out several things here. One is he didn't marry, which is a big deal for a king. He didn't leave an heir. What? how does that play into Swedish history? That must have been catastrophic. Like, who becomes king next?
Yeah, and this becomes a problem because they had still relatives that could uh, take over, but it will become a bigger problem later on. And that is why we have the Bernadotte family on our throne nowadays, because when you don't, later on when we had Charles XIII, he didn't have an heir, and then you had to find a king somewhere else. So there still was relatives that could that was of the same family as Charles XII. So, but of course, it's very unusual that you don't have a wife or a queen or leave legitimate children behind.
Yeah, that's one of the primary duties of a king, to leave an heir for the smooth succession of the kingdom or empire. Now, let's talk about Charles XII in the context of the Swedish Empire. There's a famous battle. I actually read the text for this several times. This is many years ago. I just found this so interesting. The Battle of Narva, in which the Swedish are outnumbered, but they famously beat the Russians. And at that time, I'm speaking from memory here, Professor Zander, so correct me if I'm wrong, sort of Russia is sort of open to the Swedes, and they don't go further in. Is that something that's discussed, or is this, was that a strategic mistake that limited the Swedish Empire?
Yes, I would say, and there's been so many who has written about this, because it's, of course, a choice that was so important in Swedish history. And you could say it was a number of battles that the Swedes were outnumbered and still made a success, because they had a tactic that was very offensive and was very, the enemy was terrified. And
very
often,
organized and disciplined army.
exactly.
Very impressive.
But what Charles XII does, and that is probably his big mistake, he turns his attention to Poland, because there is a ruler called August II or August the Great, and he's, among other things, mostly famous because he had so many children, and with a lot of different women. They count them in hundreds.
Oh, wow.
So, but he had some time to rule as well, and Charles XII, he hunts this August for several years in Poland, and in the end, he finds a solution, and then he says that, well, now Poland is secure. Now it's time to deal with Russia. But the mistake is that Tsar Peter has by then very much modernized and improved Russia and the Russian army. So you could say it's too late.
Yeah.
And it's kind of it's a mistake for so many reasons, because the Russians are also very skillful, because they don't want to have a battle on a big battleground. And they just retreat, and they burn, and they retreat, and they burn. And it's getting colder and colder and colder. And a lot of the Swedish soldiers, they die long before they come to the next very famous battle at Poltava. And then the Russians decide, well, let's make a more traditional battle. But by then they had made a lot of fortifications. And also Charles XII is wounded.
That's
So
true.
he's not in command. And the problem is that the three commanders under him, they haven't communicated with each other. And one of them is killed early on, and the soldiers don't know what to do. So 1/3 of the Swedish force is it's gone. And
Wow.
this as a time when they really needed to have an organized leader, and so they could trust that someone was in command. So this is a catastrophe, and they have to surrender. Most of them, not at Poltava, but they do it a few days later on, and they see that it's hopeless. The situation is hopeless.
something about the number, I forget, but it's something like 10 or 12,000 Swedish soldiers surrender, and later they stay in Russia. They become part of sort of Russian society. They provide a lot of technical skills that Russians needed. This battle of, for our audience, this battle of Poltava is actually really important. And there's a town, actually, it was a village, now it's a town in Russia. And the reason I say it's important, I'm saying this from my perspective, subject for your correction, confirmation. It becomes the beginning of the end of the Swedish Empire. Am I making too much of this?
No, I would say you're so correct.
I see.
And I think it kind of a blessing in disguise.
A blessing in disguise. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes, because Sweden couldn't have managed, I would say, to hold on to this empire for, I mean, it was so overstretched at that time. So it was just waiting to collapse, you could say. And as a positive side, you also you get a much more ethnic homogeneous country, because you lose some areas that were inhabited by people that weren't Swedes. So you get a smaller country, a country that is easier to rule, and then some 100 years later, you also lose Finland.
Yeah, yeah.
And so during the 19th century, when you have all this nationalism, there is very few groups in Sweden that says we don't want to be a part of a country, because they are already a part of a country. So you don't have to make all this integration project. And of course, some are really not treated very good. For instance, the Sami people in the north, that very, in a very brutal manner, are turned into Swedes. And that is not a proud chapter in the Swedish history.
Could you repeat their names, please?
The Sami people.
Are they like indigenous people?
Yes.
Okay.
And you find them also in Norway and Finland. And
I see.
Nomadic people also.
Yeah. I want to close with this question. You said that Charles XII is something that is discussed. Is he discussed now that we're getting close to NATO?
Not as much as he used to be. And a colleague of mine, he had a visit from the then Ukrainian ambassador to Sweden. And this was when it was a jubilee or anniversary for the Battle of Poltava.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
The Ukrainian ambassador,
which was in Ukraine.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. And he asked my colleague, are you going to make a big spectacle that Charles XII and all this? He's big man in Swedish history. And by the way, we are erecting a statue of Charles XII. And my colleague had to say no, because Charles XII is almost unmentionable in Sweden today. Because, and this is quite a story of its own, because this is a story that also deals with the First World War. And then some in Sweden wanted Sweden, that was neutral both during the First and the Second World War. They wanted Sweden to take part on the German and Austrian side. And they said that we are obliged to fulfill what Charles XII started, namely fighting the Russians. And then the same demand came during the Second World War. And also by then, Joachim von Ribbentrop, that was the Nazi German foreign minister, he meets the Swedish ambassador in Berlin, saying that, you know what, the German army is now so successful, and we did something that you didn't do. We have conquered Poltava. And this is in 1942. Don't you think it's time for you to join Germany in the great fight against Russia? So, and when you follow the history of Charles XII, he also gets kind of an idol for those who are neo-Nazis or extreme right-wingers. So
Ah,
you could say he begins in the 20th century as kind of a Germany-connected king, and then he goes on to become a king that is racist, which he, of course, wasn't, because he didn't know what it was to be a racist.
yeah,
But
yeah.
he is kind of tainted. You can't really discuss him
Oh,
nowadays
that
because
is
he has this
fascinating.
after history that is so problematic.
It's so funny. His legacy has been used by so many different uh, groups and politicians. By the way, just a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned Poklova, and I said it's in Ukraine. I just realized just about 7, 8 minutes ago in our conversation, I said Poklova in Russia. It's a town in Russia. What I meant is that in the Russian Empire back then. It is in Ukraine, yes. Let's take a break here. We'll be right back after a short break to talk about Sweden post-Empire.